Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Southeast New England Program Network, welcome to our webinar titled Demystifying Floodplain Management, What You Need to Know, brought to you by the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative in the Narragansett Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. My name is Leah Soloway from the New England Environmental Finance Center, and I'll be assisting with logistics for today's program along with Peng Suti Sambat, SNP Network Project Manager with the New England Environmental Finance Center. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce and provide you all with a little background on the SNP Network. The SNP Network's mission is to empower communities to achieve healthy watersheds, sustainable financing, and long-term climate resilience through the management of stormwater and restoration projects. The SNP Network focuses on building local capacity by providing no-cost trainings, webinars, and technical assistance to communities in the SNP region. If you'd like to learn more, please visit our website, snpnetwork.org. And before we begin the webinar, there are a few logistics to keep in mind. First, everyone will be on mute to ensure audio quality. At the end of the webinar, there'll be a Q&A session. You'll be able to ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box on your Zoom control panel. We look forward to answering your questions, so please type them in at any time. We have closed captions available for today's webinar. To view the closed captions, please click the closed captions icon in your Zoom control panel. And on that note, I'd like to hand things over to Jen West and Stephanie Covino. Thank you both for being here today.
Thanks so much for having us. I'm going to share my screen here. Perfect. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm Stephanie Covino from the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative at Clark University. I just wanted to first acknowledge that wherever you are in the watershed or wherever you are in the country, we are all on Indigenous land. So where I'm coming from in the Blackstone Watershed, which is in central Massachusetts and northern Rhode Island, we're on Nipmuc, Pokanoket, Wampanoag, and Narragansett. And we understand that these tribes have historically been the stewards of this land and continue to be the stewards of this land with very close ties to the river. So the objectives for today, what we're going to be talking about, the first is that we really want you to be able to understand what we mean by floodplain management. I know that's kind of the question in everybody's head right now. And also, what are the related municipal responsibilities to that? What do we have to do in terms of this federal floodplain management requirements? We want to help you make smart floodplain management decisions in your community, feel confident, hopefully, that's the goal, in being able to explain the basics to homeowners, businesses, or others that are dealing with floodplain issues. And then also just understand where to go next. We're going to share some resources with you at the end so that not just you can get to the basic requirements, but also kind of go above and beyond. So we kind of broke it down into what are the 5 things to know about floodplain management. And from my experience, most people do not know these, and that's okay. So don't feel dumb if you're like, wow, I had no idea. That's what we're here for today, is to really just go over the basics. So this is a good example of like, that's floodplain 101 right there, of water wants to go where it's going to go. So if we modify our land use decisions and we build in the floodplain and alter rivers, we're going to end up flooding our community. So let water go where it wants to go is kind of a good one. So what do we mean by floodplain when we say that word? When you go to I'm just going to say, I used to work for the city of Worcester. This is no shame to the city of Worcester. It's a second largest city in New England, and we had our own challenges of understanding what does this mean and how to communicate it. So I'm just using this one as an example, but when you look up on the city of Worcester's website, what a floodplain is, these are different images that come up. So, you can put your hand up, raise your hand in the chat feature if you think that this one's the floodplain for the city of Worcester. And then there's this one. Maybe that's the floodplain, the city of Worcester. And those of you who don't know Worcester are like, I don't know, maybe the whole city is a floodplain. And then there's this one. And then there's this one. So what do we mean by floodplain? We mean the last one. And really, we only mean the blue part of the last one. So the first map is flood zones in Worcester. So technically X is a flood zone, right? That's the zone where it's not likely to flood, right? But technically everything is within something where they call it like, what is this zone in a flood map? And X means basically not floodplain, but it's listing it there. This next one is reported flood events. So they did an outreach that said, where does it flood within your neighborhood? And people called in and said, this is where it floods in my neighborhood. So they made a map of that. Then they used that information to create this projected flood events and said, in the future, we think it'll flood more in these areas. And then there's this actual, like, this is where the floodplain is, which are these blue and green areas within the map. And then the orange areas are the 500-year floodplain. It's really confusing. All of this to say, it's really confusing, and we get that, and we're not judging anywhere here. So what do we mean is we're talking about the federally regulated area, also called the SFHA, which is the Special Flood Hazard Area, determined by FEMA. FEMA being the Federal Energy Management Association agency. So many acronyms. We'll also call this the 100-year flood, or the area with a base flood elevation, or BFE. So there's so many acronyms here. I know it's confusing, but when we talk about the 100-year flood, this is really a misnomer. So this is based on old statistical data from like the 1800s to the early 1900s. So it's not really commensurate with the kind of flooding that we're seeing now. So let's just kind of keep that in mind. Statistically, looking at that data, we determined where it would flood once every 100 years. There's a 1% chance of it occurring any given year. But if you think about that during your mortgage, there's statistically about a 30% chance that there could be this level of flooding during a 30-year mortgage. But realistically, again, because we're looking at old data there, it's really like every 25 years or so. So we're seeing flooding happening more frequently due to climate change. This is just an image in Worcester of an area that is not in the floodplain, but absolutely did flood. And this was highly impacted by our development patterns as well. There was a development upstream of this that caused massive runoff because they changed the land use. So this is something very important to understand, that floodplains are based on elevation. So water wants to go where it wants to go, and it's going to go in the low areas. So it can't jump, so it only goes downhill, right? Water goes downhill. So it's not necessarily about the exact area that is shown on a map. It's not exactly about that you are close to water, but it's the actual elevation that you're at and how water gets to somewhere. So that being said, sometimes it floods in areas that are not near water at all. And you're like, how did that happen? Like in the city of Worcester, because it's also based on how we've impacted our landscape. So floodplains can change over time, slowly, but they can change. And we impact our watershed. So for instance, in the Blackstone watershed, we're a highly modified watershed. We channelized the river in a lot of different areas. We really modified the flows of it. So things like that channelization, low capacity of stormwater can create stormwater flooding that may or may not be within the FEMA map. So just know that there are areas in your community that you might know flood, and you might want to consider treating like a floodplain and being careful about your development patterns there, but they might not actually show up on that map. Undersized culverts can create flooding as well, or some kind of combination of all of these different factors. So again, there might be areas that flood in your community that might not show up on this floodplain map from FEMA. So if you want to know, first off, where to go and whether an area is or is not within the federally designated FEMA floodplain, this is the place to go. There's a link here. And then you just type in an address or a Latin long there, and it will come up with a map. And how you read this map, I picked a confusing one for you. But this blue area and this blue area here with the slashes on it, that's all 100-year floodplain, FEMA regulated floodplain. The orange areas are the 500-year floodplain. We don't regulate those areas unless you have a specific regulation within your community that regulates them. These are on here just to consider where we know that water might go. So this, if you can see my mouse, like this must be a high point right here, right? So water won't get up there, no, but it might flood around it. This kind of cross-hatched area is in here, a special flood hazard area, and it's a floodway. So floodways have even higher levels of regulatory requirements, which we're not even going to get into in this webinar because we're trying to give you the basics. But just to know, if you see that, it's still floodplain. It just also is a floodway. So second thing that people don't know about floodplains, but we think is really important to share, is an elevation certificate. So an elevation certificate is a relatively simple document. It's only 2 or 3 pages long, and it's basically a survey that is filled out by a surveyor or a professional engineer, a PE, and it looks at where a building is on a landscape. So it says where are the doorways, where are the openings, where are all of these points where water might get in, and it provides down to the 0.01 inch exactly the elevation that you're at. Because if you're on a hill right in the middle of a floodplain around you, maybe that building's not actually in the floodplain, right? If you have a building that is on an area where it's floodplain, where the land is, but the building, the highest opening of that building is higher up, then that structure might be considered, the building area is out of the floodplain. So just, it's really important to know exactly where the building is in relation to this exact floodplain location. That's FEMA can give you that information. And it's required to determine whether you're basically in or out. So you can get this elevation certificate. I highly recommend, if you're ever purchasing land or a building that might be near a floodplain, it kind of looks like it's near on the map and you're not really sure where the elevation exactly is, get the elevation certificate, understand. And the elevation certificate will also say each of these openings and what elevation they're at, and it'll say whether it's in or out of the floodplain. So home buyers should always request this before purchasing a home anywhere near a floodplain. And you also can request an elevation certificate once you own a home if you think your structure is actually outside of the floodplain. So sometimes maps are not exactly correct. We're relying on old data to determine what those elevations are. And so if you think your building is outside the floodplain, you get an elevation certificate, it actually is above what that floodplain elevation is, you can submit something called a LOMA or a LOMER, which is a letter of map amendment or a letter of map revision, which again, we won't get into this too much, but just know that you can submit that to FEMA, but only if the elevation certificate is showing you're out. So every municipality that has a plane in it, which is every community in Rhode Island and many of the communities in Massachusetts, should have some sort of floodplain coordinator. And that floodplain coordinator, often within the building department or code or inspectional services, makes the determination at the local municipal level whether an elevation certificate is needed in order to do work on your home or buy a home, whatever. They make their recommendation of whether you need to fill out additional paperwork or file something additionally, like under the Wetlands Protection Act locally in Massachusetts, if they think the building is in the floodplain. But that floodplain coordinator doesn't make the final FEMA determination. That's just for our local regulations. If you think you're outside, go to FEMA. But your floodplain coordinator will look at a building and think about whether you need to consider substantial improvement. So this is the third thing that we're going to talk about, substantial improvement. If your floodplain coordinator thinks or knows that a building is within the floodplain and you want to do work on that home or that commercial structure, whatever it is, you have to consider what that structure's value is and how much you're going to invest in those updates that you're proposing. This is also sometimes called the 50% rule. So if repairs meet or exceed 50% of the structure's value, then you have to consider extra requirements. So we're going to break down what this means. And this is all about the federal government doesn't want you to make bad investments. It doesn't want you to put a bunch of money in a building that that we all know is going to flood again, and then we all have to pay out for later. So let's break this down. So repairs, what does that mean? Well, it's either a reconstruction, rehabilitation, addition, or any other improvement to a structure. This includes your built-in appliances, your HVAC, which is like heating and cooling, your roofing, electrical, your labor costs. Even if you do all the work yourself, you have to value whatever your labor costs would be. So those are all your repair costs. It's a lot. And it's regardless of the reason, whether you went through a flood and you have to fix up that structure, or you just want to put an addition on your home, or you want to redo your kitchen. If you're in a floodplain, you have to consider what your structure's value is, not the land, just the structure itself. And you typically will use the fair market value, and that's based on like the community's tax assessment. But if you think your community's tax assessment is wrong, you can provide your own appraisal, give it to your building inspector, your floodplain manager, and they can approve it and say, oh, okay, that's an appropriate appraisal, we will accept this. Or they'll say, no, we still want to use our local tax assessment. So if you have a home that is worth, say, $100,000, and you want to put an addition on your home and it's going to cost $55,000, you're over that half of the value. And so you have to, you're triggering substantial improvement. So what does that mean? It means either you can't do the work, that's it, you can't do it. Sometimes the answer is no. This is really hard for people to understand, but sometimes the answer is no. The federal government says, you're making a bad investment. That structure is going to flood. You can't put more than half of its value back into it because it's going to flood. We're going to have to pay out bad, bad, bad. Or your other option is to meet current floodplain code standards, which means you have to have the lowest opening of your building, right? Your doorways, your windows, your cellar, whatever, at least 1 foot above whatever that flood elevation is. So that might mean filling in your basement. That might mean totally raising your structure. Often this is cost prohibitive, and so people don't do it. So it happens all the time that homeowners go to their local municipality, they say, hey, I want to do this improvement and it's in a floodplain, and either the community doesn't realize what substantial improvement is, this is a federal requirement, or they don't value the work enough. They're only including, the labor, they're not including the materials, or vice versa. And they let this happen. I can say that I know for a fact this has happened in my watershed. So don't feel like embarrassed or alone if this has happened to you, or you're worried that you've never heard of this before and you're managing this at your local level. This happens all the time. It's not a good thing, but it happens. So we're hoping today to be able to introduce you to some of these things so that you have the kind of like basics, and we're happy to answer questions. Feel free to keep putting them in the chat and we'll get to them. But this is a really important one that I find people don't know about at all. So people are often freaked out and say, oh my gosh, it's my house. I should be able to do whatever I want with it. And the government doesn't want to make bad investments in their own homes. So any home that has a mortgage has to go through this. So what about historic structures? There are specific requirements around historic structures. So I would put you back to the substantial improvement fact FAQ from FEMA, which I'll give you in just a minute, but you have to read that very specifically. And historic structures are not just, oh, it's old, so we should be able to do whatever we want. It has to have some sort of specific historic value. It has to be designated as a historic structure, and whatever repairs or alterations you're doing have to not preclude that the structure has that continued designation. The last thing is, what if there's a violation? If there's a code or safety violation that I have to fix? Well, if you have specific documented violations, you are able to fix those specific violations, and just those, without triggering substantial improvement. However, anything else on top of that, we have to fix this, but we're also going to like replace that built in when we do it. That would count towards substantial improvement. So this is the place to go when you're like, oh my goodness, what is substantial improvement? Here is the link, and it's this really fantastic document, answers about substantially damaged buildings, and it's very easy to understand as far as floodplain management goes. You can kind of go through and get your basic questions answered, and it has lots of images and simple language. So I recommend that you check it out. So number 4, we're almost there, guys. Basic land-water interaction. This is basically the first slide I showed you too. It's a reminder that water wants to go somewhere. If you remove its ability to go into the ground, right? If you have a forest or a farm field and you develop it, you put on a parking lot, or you just have bare dirt in the construction process, water can't go back into the ground very easily. And so it will run off, it will find somebody else. It will find someplace else to go. So be really intentional about where you want water to go during construction, or it will find its own way. When you're planning for development, think about at least the 1-year storm. Usually you want to think about, is this project going to be under development for maybe more than a year? Maybe it's 3 years. Maybe you want to think about what's your 3-year storm and plan for your temporary sediment basins to be able to hold that much water. Because again, if you're going to create an intentional place for that water to go on a construction site, that is better. I saw a place in Worcester that they didn't plan for a good large storm and their temporary sediment basins, and it washed out so heavily that it broke through a concrete wall onto Route 9, and 3 different people called 911. Water will find a way. So please be intentional about your construction and make sure it has somewhere to go and be able to get back in the ground. So planners and permitting authorities can always ask for more. You have these federal requirements from FEMA. You might have your own land use standards locally in your community. And the MS4, the municipal separate storm sewer system, right? Your stormwater permit. Stormwater permits require that you have to consider low impact development. A lot of our regulations require your consideration of low impact development, but planners don't actually usually say, hey, why didn't you use low impact development? Why didn't you think about using a rain garden here, an infiltration basin, or retaining some of your mature vegetation? And we should always remember that we have the ability to ask those questions of our applicants. It is the burden of proof is on the applicant to show you they are not going to make an impact to this area. They should be able to do their project without making an impact. And it's our job to put, as planners, to put requirements on their permit that say you have to follow X, Y, and Z in order to not make an impact, right? So always ask about low impact development. So like I said, this is federal, FEMA is federal, floodplain management is federal, but also states have specific requirements as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Massachusetts. I'm going to hand it over to Jen to talk a little bit about Rhode Island. And then sometimes there are local requirements as well. So you might have a floodplain overlay district, or you might have other specific requirements about, stormwater management and, how that might flood, et cetera. So in Massachusetts, under the Wetlands Protection Act, we have this thing called compensatory storage. So if you add fill being a building or dirt or footings for a pier or whatever it is, you have to add new floodplain at every 1 foot elevation. So think about it like a bathtub, or this picture here, like a glass of water. The water level is low. You put an apple in there because that's what we do, right? We put apples in glasses of water, and the water level increases. So that's the same thing. If you're putting fill in a floodplain, when it floods, it can't go to where that building is or where that fill is. So it has to go around it. So it's going to flood higher. So you might be affecting your neighbors and having them flood more than would otherwise have been there. And we can't do that. Not allowed, not allowed. So if you think about this image on the bottom, if this building were outside of the floodplain, it's going to flood there and it's going to flood right there. But we wanted to put a building over on the right on top of this floodplain, and we wanted to fill part of that floodplain in, they can't flood there anymore. So we can't do that. So thinking about this, there we go. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to dig it deeper somewhere else, because you have to be able to add the same amount of floodplain, the ability for that water to flood at every elevation. So again, it's all about elevations. Water is going to go first at the lowest point, and then it's going to move up, right? So you have to be able to add new floodplain, not floodplain under existing floodplain, because that doesn't count. Hopefully that makes sense. So if you are trying to build somewhere where the entire parcel is in the floodplain, you don't have any opportunity to create new floodplain, an area that was not previously floodplain that you're turning into floodplain. And so there's no opportunity for compensatory storage. And so the answer is no, you cannot build there. This is a really hard thing for developers and homeowners to understand. And I have told so many people, no, you can't build there. And they tell me, that is madness. Yes, I can. I will figure out a way. The answer is just no sometimes. And it's really hard for people to get, but sometimes we have to be pushy and say, this is what the regulations say. And if your whole parcel is floodplain, you just can't build there. So as a recap, the 5 things to know about floodplain. What is a floodplain? We're talking about FEMA 100-year floodplain based on elevations and sometimes the impact that we've created over time. What is an elevation certificate? This determines whether you're in or out of the floodplain. It's from a professional engineer, and homeowners should always get this. What is substantial improvement? You can't invest more than half, 50% or more of a structure's value if it's in the floodplain without meeting new current building code standards. Basic land-water interaction is that water will always find a way, so give it good options. Think about where the water is going to go before it's a problem. And then if you have locally specific regulations, so Massachusetts calls it compensatory storage, Rhode Island calls it something else, but it's basically the same thing. And meaning that you have to have new floodplain for any fill that you're adding. And sometimes if it's all floodplain, you just can't do it. So we're going to pause for a second here, catch our breath, think about what all of our questions are, and I'm going to hand it over to Jen.
Yes, I think, hi, everyone. So Stef, there's a lot of questions from what I could tell, and I actually don't know if you all can see everybody else's questions. So I'm gonna, if you don't mind, Stef, I'm gonna throw out a few to you, and then I'll wrap things up. So one of them is, can renters request an elevation certificate?
That's a great question. I wish there were better regulations around requiring that they have this power to do that. You can certainly ask your landlord for one. I don't think that they're required to provide it to you as a renter. It's really a homeowner responsibility, but it's a great question to know if you're living in a floodplain or not.
Yeah, thank you. And my colleague Thais did confirm that they cannot see the other questions asked. So folks, if you could bear with me, there's a lot of questions. There may be some that are similar, so I'm going to try to group them. And we also have some comments in the Q&A that are very helpful that we'll put together and send out. Like Joy has told us that in CRS communities, an elevation certificate is required for all new construction, but non-CRS communities can choose to use the elevation certificate or not. So there's some tidbits of information. And Joy is the state floodplain manager for the state of Massachusetts. So thanks, Joy, for being here. And
anything I know about floodplains, I learned from Joy. So
there we go.
I hope I'm doing you proud, Joy.
Yeah, she also says, yeah, she's got a lot of tidbits in here. The 1 foot freeboard is for A zones, and a V zone, the freeboard is 2 feet. This again, just for mass. even homes without a mortgage in the floodplain have to follow the substantial improvement, substantial damage rule. Let me see what other questions, because there's some in the Q&A and there's some in the chat. Who or what agency issues the elevation certificate?
So it's not an agency that issues it, it's up to someone to get it. So a developer or a homeowner would request that from a professional engineer, a surveyor. It can be required by a community though. So if like what Joy was saying, if there's new construction, they have to do an elevation certificate to show that they built it correctly and out of that floodplain. So once the building is under construction, they can do an elevation certificate. And then once it's completed, they can do an elevation certificate showing it's above that 1 foot freeboard. But it's up to the homeowner or the developer to get it and to pay for it.
Yep. Yeah, and speaking of paying for it, it says, somebody asked, how much does requesting an elevation certificate usually cost? And can homeowners request them, even if the municipal floodplain coordinator concludes it is not required?
Yeah, you can always get one, no matter what. If you feel like you want to get one and you're able to pay for it, you can get one. You don't have to have anyone else's permission to get an elevation certificate. If you're living in a structure, theoretically, the community should have an elevation certificate on file from when it was built. If it's, past like the 80s when we were starting to pay attention to this. However, from experience, I can say that we basically never had them on file. So you can ask your community if they have it, but usually you have to just get it yourself. And it depends on how complicated your structure is and how many openings it has and how big it is, but I would say a few $1,000s.
Thanks, Steph. Can a homeowner piecemeal it? For instance, do one improvement 1 year, a few years later do another, so each one is less than 50% of value, but over 10 years they add up to well over 50%. Is there a time?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
To consider cumulative improvements?
It's a really good question. So under federal regulations, you can do that. Is it the intent of the regulation? No. But communities sometimes get around it by allowing people to do that, to say just under the 50% multiple times. Some communities can also adopt local regulations that say, we do consider cumulative impacts, and anything within like a 5-year period or however much they want to say would be considered put together to determine substantial improvement. But I don't know that there are a lot of communities that have done that, but it's not encouraged.
Right. And Joy, also, there's a couple different places where Joy provided links, the FEMA substantial improvements, substantial damage deaths reference. We have links for that. Again, we're going to send all of this afterwards because Jennifer asked, we are going to have access to these slides, right? Yes, I believe that's true, right, Steph?
100%.
Yeah, and the links have been shared. Haven't these FEMA substantial improvement requirements exceptions been incorporated into the Massachusetts building code? I think that's true, correct?
I'm not a building code expert, but yes, this is a requirement and it's reflected within state regs that we have to follow these federal requirements.
If the entire parcel is in the floodplain, can someone build on a column foundation? Gosh.
No, because are you going to float? If you're floating in the air, go for it. If you're not floating, you're putting fill on that land.
Do any FEMA floodplain maps or elevations account for total impervious surface within the watershed, including development outside the floodplain?
Great question. Not to my understanding. They are going through and updating the floodplain maps periodically. So I think they're going through an update right now within the Blackstone, for instance, but I don't think it looks specifically at impervious, and I don't think it appropriately reflects the amount of development that we have created and affected the runoff from. So there are always going to be areas that we know are flooding due to, culvert backups or catch basin backups from stormwater that are not necessarily reflected within that FEMA map because they're not necessarily hydraulically connected. to the floodplain. Sometimes it's just a specific low area that we know always backs up somewhere. So it's not perfect.
Yep. What if a proposed addition is partially in the floodplain?
Oh, that's a really good question. If any portion of your structure is within the floodplain, it is considered within the floodplain.
Mhm.
The structure is in the floodplain if any piece of it is in the floodplain.
How is compensatory storage handled under the Wetlands Protection Act in Zone A? No BFE. Can the approving authority require a flood study, or are there limitations in the regulations?
Man, you guys are testing me.
I'm glad you're getting these and not me. We can also defer and
I was going to say, I
answer-
might defer to
Yeah.
Joy to answer that more thoroughly than I can. Joy, if you're able to unmute yourself.
And I think, Joy, are you able to unmute yourself? Or does our producer have to unmute you?
Someone just let me. Can you-
Okay, perfect. Hi, Joy.
Hi.
Thanks for being
Yeah,
here.
so, in an unnumbered A zone, if, the local conservation commission, conservation agent allows the, proponent to show how they are providing compensatory storage, as Steph said, foot by foot, they kind of can do it with table math, if you will. I mean, I've seen communities do that. I've seen where communities don't require the person to find a base flood elevation, but in some cases, they just require someone to find a base flood elevation. It depends on who's doing the engineering, I guess. So if it's like a big development, I would think they would require an engineer to provide an H&H study to figure out what the base flood elevation is. But if it's a small unnumbered A zone in a pasture, and for some reason someone wants to put something right there, I think I have seen where local communities just do the math, you know, foot by foot to allow that to expand. Best thing Steph said is, if it's totally floodplain and you cannot provide comp storage, you can't build. That's a higher standard. It's fabulous. Fabulous.
Thanks
So-
so much, Joy. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just to clarify, an H&H is a hydraulic and hydrologic study.
Yeah.
Basically how water moves.
Yep, more of those acronyms. Thanks so much, Joy, and
Thank
we
you.
might need you again. Let's see here. What else do we have? Oh, and Katie is just clarifying for us that SISD, no, that's substantial improvement and substantial damage is in the building code for both Rhode Island and Mass. I knew it was in Rhode Island and I assumed for Mass, so that just clarifies that. Is the elevation certificate cost for the new home buyer or the current property owner?
Whoever's proposing the work,
Yeah, whoever's proposing the work. Yep.
whoever the applicant is who's saying, I want to do something to this structure.
And I don't know if you could speak to this stuff, but I'll just put it out there. Can you talk about the implications of floodplain management for agricultural areas? For example, if a farmer wants to improve drainage of hayfields or reduce erosion along a stream, is there a crediting program for reconnecting floodplains?
That's a great question. And I am sad to say that I haven't worked in agricultural areas, despite my background in this picture right here. Very much. Joy, do you know the answer to that one?
You know, I don't know. So when you talk about credit, as in someone getting points for something, the only familiarity I have in my job with credits is if you're in a community rating system community, a CRS community. And then it's possible that the CRS program does offer credits for reconnecting or restoring parts of a floodplain. Matter of fact, I think that they do. But you know, just in general, FEMA does have a really good guidance document. I'll put the link in the chat for agricultural communities, floodplain management in agricultural communities. And generally we refer people to that when they have those kinds of questions, like a barn or a livestock pavilion or something that's partly in the floodplain. We generally refer them to that FEMA guidance.
Thanks, Joy. Yeah, and Jake, I'm going to talk a little bit about CRS, but also for everyone's sake, I just want to let you know that we are looking at these questions and the comments and determining what follow-up webinars or resources we could actually provide you, that because this is definitely high level overview, the basics, and we could get into a lot of detail in future opportunities. So know that that is in our thoughts. One last one, if elevation certificates are based on FEMA maps they're based on current and past floods, not future flooding. Correct. Yes, that is correct.
Well, sort of, there were two different kind of things in there. Elevation certificates are based on what is the actual elevation of that structure standing there in real life. That's what an elevation certificate says. However, one of the pieces of information on an elevation certificate is what is the flood elevation? And that flood elevation, yes, is based off of old stuff. So it gets really confusing to try and explain this. So I'm like, I don't know if I did a good job, but FEMA and 100-year floodplain is old data, right? That's one thing. That's not easy to change. And then you have stormwater. We do have the ability to regulate stormwater in a different way. We can ask people when they're developing and making a stormwater report to use newer rainfall data, like instead of using technical paper 40, TP40, which is from the like 30s or 40s, right, 40, we can ask them to use things like NOAA Atlas 14 or Cornell data, which is not still considering future, but is a longer period of time. It's like 1800s to 2014 instead of 1800s to, 1920 or something. So with that longer time period, we can evaluate the statistical likelihood of a storm occurring at different intervals. So on stormwater side, we can have better requirements and think about larger storms. You can also change your regulations locally to include future looking data like NOAA Atlas 14 plus. So that tries to get into some of this, like climate change is making bigger storms, but we can't change the FEMA side. FEMA is FEMA, 100-year floodplain is 100-year floodplain. You can regulate more than your 100-year floodplain locally. If you want to say, hey, we're going to regulate our 500-year floodplain, you can do that locally. Communities don't very often because it really expands the area. But at the federal level, it is what it is based on those elevations. Does that make sense? Joy, go ahead.
Thank you. I want to say right now, if a community tries to do something like that, it might be considered by the state to be in conflict with the building code because the building code regulates flood resistant standards for the FEMA 1% chance floodplain, as you were saying. And so if you expand the regulatory area of the building code, someone may say, well, that's in conflict. But the good news is that the state has a project right now going on. It's a BRIC project for building code improvement. And it's a project that will give local municipalities, when this is done, I guess at the end of this year, there will be a guidance document for local municipalities in Massachusetts on, number one, all of the different higher floodplain standards you can have that do not conflict with the building code. And number two, if you want to have something that conflicts with the building code, this guidance document will tell you how to go about that. So we're really excited about that. It's going to come out around the end of the year, and we're going to also have lots of training sessions, just like this one, to talk about that with local communities, because we really want folks to have all the higher standards for flood resistant construction they can have. And one last note real quickly, this is kind of new too. FEMA is one of the federal agencies that has to implement the federal flood risk management standard. And in that federal flood risk management standard, one of the options for defining the floodplain is climate science data. Well, so what does that mean? So they are looking at producing in the future, and don't hold your breath, an overlay on the FEMA maps that will be somewhat future oriented with some kind of climate science data, that if someone wants to implement the federal flood risk management standard using that, they will have some information from FEMA. Again, don't hold your breath. It will cost a lot of money, and Congress just isn't all about that right now. But that is conversation that's happening at the federal level. So while the FEMA maps don't show any future flood risk right now, there's a potential, maybe in my lifetime, that it will.
That's super exciting. Thank you so much, Joy.
Thanks, Joy. And just in the interest of explaining acronyms, BRIC is the FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program. It is 10:45. I do want to talk to you all a little bit. I shouldn't take that long, but apologies if we didn't get to every question. I'm just going to see if there's any clarifying questions though, just so we don't leave. If there's more substantial questions that we can do another webinar on. But this might be one. Can you please explain what you mean by add new floodplain?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So you have, when you're building something, you have cuts and fills. So fill is you're adding a pile of dirt or you're adding a building, putting on top, and a cut is that you're literally digging out and making the elevation lower. So you have to have appropriate cuts and fills so that it evens out. And when you add all your cuts together at every single elevation, so if you make a little cut or you make a really big cut, right? If you make a really big cut, really deep, you have a lot of different elevations that you're using. If you make a shallow cut, it's just a couple elevations. So you have to have the appropriate amount of cuts and fills at every 1 foot elevation when you're doing work in a floodplain to make sure that where water was going to go before at every elevation, it still can go now, just maybe in a different direction on your parcel, if that sort of makes sense. So when you get a plan of land of what people are proposing, there's a cut fill analysis chart on the top that says we cut and filled at each of these different levels, and it has to equal a negative or zero at each of these, because you can't have a plus, you can't have added fill in any of the different elevations. And that's put together by an engineer. Does that kind of make sense?
Thank
Okay.
you, Steph. Yeah, we should probably move on. Apologies if we did not get to your question, but we will follow up. We will save the chat, we will save the Q&A, and we will get back to you. But I just want to quickly talk about, and full disclosure, I am not a floodplain manager, and neither is Steph, although she knows a heck of a lot for not being one. And that's why we decided to do this webinar as non-floodplain managers. And so we're kind of giving the perspective of, I work with communities, I provide training and technical assistance on a variety of issues. So this is just coming from my perspective and working with them. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the going above and beyond. So we have these foundations at the local level, the comprehensive plan, the hazard mitigation plan, those are kind of, must do's. They build on each other, they reinforce each other. They have, this information about recurring hazards, past impacts, identified in the hazard mitigation plan, help determine the priority hazards to be included in the comp plan, and which establishes goals, priorities, actions, sort of the blueprint for the community. So in comp plans, and at least in Rhode Island, we must incorporate natural hazards and climate change. There's some guidance on that from the statewide planning program. And so then we have the NFIP, which basically Steph just talks about all of that, right? And all 39 Rhode Island municipalities and one tribal nation participate in this. REMA, Rhode Island Emergency Management Agency. Their planning branch is responsible for administering the NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program, in Rhode Island. And so most of the things that Steph mentioned, special flood hazard areas, flood insurance rate maps, elevation certificates, substantial improvements, those are all sort of components of the NFIP. And there's these buckets of, there's mapping, regulations, and insurance, which is kind of part of the NFIP. So in Rhode Island, most of the minimum standards are met or exceeded by existing state regs, namely the Rhode Island Building Code. But then the remaining must be adopted by the communities, whether it's in bylaws or ordinances. So then we also have, sorry, I lost my place here. Floodplain ordinances, again, building code I mentioned, emergency, sort of standard operations around emergency response and recovery. So those are kind of the basics, foundational things. And then it's really important to think about going above and beyond if your community hasn't already. And this is through community rating system, which I'll talk more about in just a second, maybe acquisition, incentives, retrofitting, outreach, and we could have webinars on each one of these things in the future, but there are different ways to go above and beyond. And I do want to mention that from on FEMA's webpage, it says, while FEMA has minimum floodplain management standards for communities participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, adopting higher standards will lead to safer, stronger, and more resilient communities. So that is right on their webpage. So it's municipalities incentivizing developers maybe to build to higher standards, joining the CRS, retrofitting properties, maybe acquiring flood-prone properties, engaging residents through outreach programs. And I just want to mention that in terms of the resources, the mapping, we talked about the firms, the flood insurance rate maps, and Rhode Island has a floodplain mapping tool, and you can go on there to get a sense of, you know, where the property is. But also we have things like storm tools, which is coastal, but it shows storm inundation with and without sea level rise for different types of storms that could occur along our coast in the future. So that's getting to those future conditions. It's a great tool. From what I understand, I believe that CRMC, our Coastal Resources Management Council, and University of Rhode Island are, I believe, trying to get BRIC funding, this FEMA Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities money, to start to get that mapping inland for those inland communities. So that's a great thing. So community rating system, voluntary program, recognizes and encourages community floodplain management activities that exceed the minimum requirements of NFIP, and saves policyholders money on their annual flood insurance premiums. So if we could go to the next slide, please. And just showing you, there is a community rating system coordinator's guide, which is really, really comprehensive about how to do it in your community. But there's also this nice local officials guide to, they say, saving lives, preventing property damage, and reducing the cost of flood insurance. So if you wanted to hear more about it, and there's also this green guide, which is really great. And that was put together by the Association for State Floodplain Managers, ASFPM, and CSO, the Coastal States Organization. And this is intended to be used alongside the coordinator's manual. But what it does is it highlights 25 of the 94 elements in the coordinator's manual, which have beneficial impacts beyond flood risk reduction. So it's this co-benefits, which is important to stress, I think, all the time. So it's, natural and beneficial functions of the floodplains, creation of habitat, enhanced air and water quality, restoration of natural ecosystems, additional opportunities for recreation and interaction with nature. So these 25 elements can add up to a substantial number of points. And you only need 4,500 points to achieve a 45% reduction in flood insurance premiums. And the open space preservation element is pretty amazing. You can get a lot of points just from that activity 420. And so anyway, if you're not familiar with this, or if your community is not a CRS community, highly recommend looking into it. And next slide, please. And then, this is just to show you, I got Melinda Hopkins, who's fabulous. She's our state floodplain manager in Rhode Island. She couldn't make it today, but she updated this for me. And these are the CRS communities in Rhode Island. So just to show you, there's different classes, and there's the discount you can get. So we have in these communities that are CRS communities, we have almost 5,000 policies, and with an estimated savings of like $500,000. So it's pretty impressive. And that's where we are in Rhode Island. So that's the CRS. Next slide. And just a couple other things I want to mention about going above and beyond. Some really great resources in Massachusetts, and Stef has done webinars on this, and there's a lot of great resources, is they have this bylaw tool. It's comparing the local land use regulations in Massachusetts municipalities with best practices. And so you go through this and you can see, you know, where are we falling short? What's the best practice? How can we tweak our regs or ordinances, et cetera? So that's awesome. And then in Rhode Island, we have this municipal self-assessment of low impact development. So we have a low impact development site planning and design guide, which is great. And all of this we can send you links to, but there's this municipal self-assessment that goes along with it, and developed by URI, DOT, DEM. Sorry for all the acronyms, but great resource. If you haven't done this, highly recommend it. And there are people who can help you with this. So definitely let us know. Tons of other resources. SNEP Network has a lot of great ones. We're going to send them to you. Rhode Island Emergency Management Agency, Massachusetts. And then we have our sort of professional organizations in each state. Massachusetts Association for Floodplain Management. If you're not familiar, you might want to look into it, might want to join. And in Rhode Island Flood Mitigation Association. Again, if you're not a member, I highly recommend it. They're great. I know Emily Morse, I think I saw, was on today. And so thanks for joining us. And I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to keep going. This is really what I wanted to kind of leave you all with. And I don't think we're going to have a lot of time to talk about it, but I'm coming from the perspective of working with communities and hearing their challenges. And, you know, if you're in an NFIP community, you are required to have a coordinator. And Stef and I were talking about, you know, a lot of people don't even know who theirs is, or if they are the person officially responsible for it. And that's okay. Like, this is common. And also, municipalities are so just have so many things to do, so many priorities, don't have the time, don't have the capacity. And it's really, you know, kind of getting people together if you can. And this is from FEMA's webpage as well. Floodplain management is a community-based effort to prevent or reduce the risk of flooding, resulting in a more resilient community. Multiple groups with a stake in protecting their communities from flooding carry out floodplain management functions, including zoning, building codes, enforcement, education, planning. It goes on and on. So this is really everybody's job. That sometimes, you know, when it's everybody's job, it's nobody's job, but you are supposed to have a coordinator if you're an NFIP community. But it's like getting together and talking about this, because planners that I know are get really tough questions, right? It's, you know, I want an elevation certificate, or what exactly am I in an SFHA, and what exactly does that mean? And how do I deal with this? And they are stretched very, very thin and often just can't respond. It's administratively burdensome to do a lot of the procedural requirements to do this. And so we need more capacity at the local level. So just want to put that out there, and just getting together with your fellow staff, municipal staff and officials, and talking about it. What are your goals? And it's 10:59, right in time. I guess we don't have time for questions, which is fine, because we had a lot of time in between, but I'll kick it back to Stef and the SNEP folks if you want to say any last words.
Just a note of hope. When I was in Worcester, we were a level 9, which is the lowest to still be a CRS community. And I learned all of this because we were at our 5-year re-up period to see if we could stay in the program. And because of everything that we learned, and because of all the training that was provided to us by folks like Joy, we actually went up to a level 7 community and saved thousands of dollars in taxpayer dollars for folks who were in their floodplain insurance premiums. So there is hope. It's possible. There's tons of information out there, and we want to be helpful. Hang or Leah, anything else?
No, just thank you both for being here, and we'll be definitely sending follow-up materials to all the attendees. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.